Hey, I'm Josh Hawkins, and this is episode 60 of Opening Up the Gospels. In the last episode, I talked about the calling of Matthew as Jesus' fifth disciple, at least from what the Gospels tell us. We looked at how Matthew was a tax collector, which was a despised occupation in first century Israel. Because Matthew's tax booth was in Capernaum by the Sea of Galilee, he probably not only had heard Jesus teach, but might have even seen him perform some miracles, because so much of Jesus' ministry was happening in and around Capernaum. After Jesus had called him to a formal discipleship relationship, imagine what the interaction between the fisherman and Matthew was like. The despised guy who had collected their sea taxes was now part of the group of disciples who had been formally called by Jesus. In this episode, I want to talk about the last significant event in Jesus' early Galilean ministry, and that's Jesus' official calling of the 12 disciples. Luke 6 records this event, but there's a couple of other things that we see Jesus doing beforehand. So let's look at our timeline for a second. We left off with the calling of Matthew and then the feast that he held for Jesus in his own home. Then in Mark 2 and Luke 5, we see Jesus talking about fasting and mourning for the bridegroom. I think this is significant on many levels, as Jesus talks about how fasting is not merely an external observance, but a posture of the heart in mourning. In context, I believe Jesus is talking about mourning for the restoration of Israel. While Jesus is with them, they're to rejoice, but a day is coming when they will mourn for him to come again and do what he's promised. Now, the next thing we see in Mark 2 and Luke 6 is Jesus and his disciples going through grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples are hungry, and so they pluck some of the heads and eat. And some Pharisees approach them and ask them why they were violating their traditions about not doing work on the Sabbath. Jesus once again confronts and confounds them. And the third event that we see is Jesus healing a man with a withered hand. And once again, that happened on the Sabbath day. And so he's confronting the authorities about the very same issue. Do you see how Jesus is coming against their traditions again and again and again and again? And now we come to the calling of the 12, and here we are perhaps somewhere around 10 months after Jesus had officially begun his public ministry by cleansing the temple in Jerusalem. Let's read from Luke 6. In these days he went out to the mountain to pray, and all night he continued in prayer to God. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles. Before we look at who these 12 are, there's a common misunderstanding I want to clear up for you. For me, for a while, I just imagined that there was just the 12 apostles and then the crowds and the multitudes of people that just swarmed around with Jesus kind of wherever he went. But there's another group in there. Remember, we've already been through perhaps 10 months of Jesus' public ministry, where his fame has gone throughout Israel and especially up in Galilee, where he spent most of his time. There were surely many people at this point who were following Jesus as disciples, but they were not formal disciples. They probably would have followed Jesus around mostly everywhere, but it never received that formal invitation to a teacher-disciple relationship, as the others had been, at least as far as we know. So take a look at this diagram. The Gospels distinguish between all these groups a lot, and it's really easy for us to just brush over the details if we're not actually aware of this. So first, we have the multitudes, the crowds, the people who came to Jesus when he was in their city or when he was out in the desolate areas of Israel. Then we have the larger group of disciples, again, the people who had heard of Jesus and then followed him around to places everywhere he went, but had not been invited into a formal discipleship relationship. Then within the larger group, we have the 12, the group that Jesus had called formally. And then even within that group, we see there are three particular ones, Peter, James, and John, who had an even more special relationship with Jesus. Does this make sense? As you read the Gospels, I hope now you'll be a little bit more aware of how the authors often distinguish between these four groups. So the 12 is the group that I want to focus on today. As we read in Luke 6, we see that out of the multitudes and out of the disciples, Jesus spent the night in prayer and decides on 12 of those disciples who would be the ones who would turn the world upside down and would be the foundation of the church for thousands of years to come. Likely these guys were rough around the edges and young and immature and had absolutely no idea what was really happening when Jesus chose them. Even though several of these guys had been with Jesus from the beginning, it was here that they were set apart in a formal sense. And this again is just a little over a year before his crucifixion. Think about what must have been going through their mind. They had heard of Jesus' fame. They had seen so many amazing things that he had done. And now these 12 were being confirmed as the ones who would have their names on the foundation of the New Jerusalem. Of course, they didn't know that at the time, but still, there's plenty of information that they did have. Just to imagine how much they were freaking out. That's crazy. Let's keep reading in Luke 6. And when day came, he called his disciples and chose from them 12, whom he named apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, and Andrew his brother, and James and John, and Philip, and Bartholomew, and Matthew, and Thomas, and James the son of Alphaeus, and Simon who was called the Zealot, and Judas the son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Now, this is Luke's list of the 12, but if we were to read from Matthew and Mark and the book of Acts, we would see some differences that might make us think that they're actually different people that are being talked about. But that isn't the case. It's very clear that the gospel authors saw the 12 as extremely important for the transmission of the truths about Jesus, such that they could not merely be anonymous characters in the story. Luke is the most explicit in this regard, especially in the opening sentences of his gospel. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. Do you see that? Luke is saying that his account is based on those who were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word. So the naming of the 12 is significant in the Gospels for this very reason. All right, so let's look at the list of the 12. The first thing you'll notice among each of the lists is that they're grouped into 3 groups of 4 names, with the exception that in the list in Acts, it leaves out Judas Iscariot. In the first group, Peter is always the head. In the second, it's Philip. And in the third, it's James the son of Alphaeus. The order of the other names in each group varies, but Judas Iscariot does always take the last place in the list that include him. In the first list, we can see 2 pairs of brothers, Simon Peter and Andrew, and then James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Scholars say that in the second and the third groups, the variation in order is probably best explained by how the way the list was remembered, either by oral tradition or by the gospel writer themselves. There's only a few names that are seemingly different between these 4 lists. In the first group, we see Simon given the name Peter, which is, of course, something Jesus called him directly. Mark says that James and John had the nickname Sons of Thunder. And in the second group, we see Matthew being called the tax collector. The third list is where it gets somewhat interesting, though. There's this guy named Thaddeus, who isn't seen in Luke and Acts, but there's another guy named Judas, the son of James, in Luke and Acts. So are these the same guy? Well, the answer is yes. Thaddeus was just the Greek name for Judas. Sometimes Jews in the time of Jesus would bear both Semitic and Greek names. And for obvious reasons of distinction after Judas Iscariot betrayed Jesus, it made sense to call Judas the son of James by his Greek name, Thaddeus. There's so much more that could be said about the 12 and who they were. There's a resource that I've really enjoyed by Richard Bauckham, and it's called Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. And it goes into all sorts of detail about how the Gospels are based on eyewitness accounts and how the readers would have seen them that way. I've included a link below this video just in the description, so definitely check it out if it interests you. But the biggest points I want you to come away from this episode are, number 1, that there was a larger group of people called Jesus' disciples beyond just the 12 apostles. These are people who followed Jesus but were never called into a formal discipleship relationship by Jesus. And secondly, the lists of the 12 apostles are consistently and carefully preserved by the gospel authors as authoritative eyewitnesses of the story of Jesus. These guys had no idea what Jesus was calling them into and how it would be through their obedience and witness that the truths of the gospel would be preserved for us even today. The calling of the 12 ends the period I'm calling Jesus' early Galilean ministry. There's a little over a year left in Jesus' public ministry before his crucifixion. In the next episode, I'll begin to introduce the middle Galilean period, where things get even more dramatic. If you've missed any of the other episodes in this series, you can find them all on my website, www.joshuahawkins.com/gospels. Don't forget, you can also sign up to receive short email notifications for new episodes there as well, if that interests you. Well, God bless, and I will see you next time.